The issue of chemicals in the environment is a story about science, politics, health, and humanity's relationship with the planet. My name is Chris Hughes, independent scientist and founder of Embark, and this is the Chemical Journeys podcast. Join me as we uncover the story of chemicals in the environment through conversations with individuals working in this space. I hope to take you on a fascinating journey full of enlightening ideas, differing perspectives, and new understanding. So, let's get started. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chemical Journeys podcast. My name is Chris Hughes, and I'm here today with Jen Vanderhoven from the BBIA. Thanks for joining me, Jen.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, and I first came across Jen and the BBIA, I think it was when I was watching a recording of an event that the Royal Society of Chemistry had put on polymers in liquid formulations. And since then, I've sort of been following what Jen's been doing on social media and what the BBIA have been doing. It's fair to say, Jen, you're pretty prolific on social media.
Yeah, I take that as a compliment, Chris. Well, I think it's really important that we try and raise the profile and the voice of the bio-based sector. I've got a real soft spot for biochemistry, did my PhD in that, so really like to support, as you said, Royal Society of Chemistry events and basically spam everyone with pictures of those events on LinkedIn and other platforms.
Yeah, no, it's really effective marketing, so well done for that. And then recently as well, I saw that because, well, we'll go into what the BBIA is about, but for me, I thought it was something that was really linked to the interests that I have in the work that I'm doing. And you recently had an event called the Demeter Awards, and there was an opportunity to exhibit at that event. So I had my first exhibition at your event, which was really fantastic. So thank you for that opportunity. And I'd just like to start, if we can, with a bit about you and also the BBIA. So let's go with what is the BBIA and what is your role within it?
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that. So the BBIA, that's the Bio-Based and Biodegradable Industries Association. So we're a trade association in the UK, and we support a range of companies from SMEs right through to large corporates and also academics, etc., who are working in the bio-based sector. And really, we're here to try and transition our way away from fossil resources and use more sustainable resources. So, for example, biomass, whether that's waste biomass or plants or trees or microorganisms, and try and replace the everyday things that we use in our lives with more sustainable ones. Because as you know, Chris, 96% of all manufactured goods contain chemicals. And actually, without chemicals, we wouldn't have a modern society. We'd be walking around naked because we'd have no clothes. We wouldn't have medicines that we need to save lives, batteries for cars, mobile phones, etc. But the production of those chemicals that we use in everyday products accounts for around 10% of greenhouse gases, which is pretty bad when we think about that. So basically, our everyday lives are destroying the planet. And we need to replace the chemicals with nicer ones. So that's what we're trying to do at the BBIA. And I am the Chief Operating Officer, which basically means I have to do everything that anyone else doesn't want to do. So I run the association and make sure that everything is going swimmingly for our members. We've got 4 key pillars to the work that we do. The first is around influencing. So we really want to advocate for a better policy environment for bio-based, biodegradable and compostable materials and chemicals. The second one is around innovation. So we get involved in loads of really cool research projects. The third one is around connecting. So we want to build this huge cohort of people who are on a mission to reduce our reliance on fossil resources. And then the last one's around communication, because we want to really demystify what bio-based kind of chemicals and materials are and why they're really beneficial to society.
No, that's really great introduction, and it does feel like a hugely important and purposeful mission. So really, really good. So how long have you been at the BBIA? And can you give us a bit of information on the backstory to it and, where is it going as well?
Yeah, so the BBIA was created, I think it was 2015, primarily
Right.
for organisations who were creating compostable and biodegradable packaging. And that was David Newman who used to run that, and I took over last December and got the board's kind of agreement that we should really widen the scope of the BBIA to be more than just compostable packaging. So it's everything from bio-based chemicals through to the materials of the future, who knows what they might be that are bio-based, but also including that kind of compostable part as well. So yeah, I took over a year ago. We've doubled our membership in the last year, which is fantastic, which just shows the energy of the sector and how it's really starting to boom. And yeah, we've got some wonderful board members from some great organisations, and hopefully we're going to expand further in 2025.
I hadn't realised there'd been that sort of shift in the scope quite so recently, but I definitely recognised that the complexity of the different issues and the types of materials that you're trying to pull together within the BBIA feels like a bit of a
Yeah,
challenge because you've got bio-based and biodegradable. So within that, you have
yeah.
biodegradable plastics, bio-based plastics, not always biodegradable, bio-based chemicals, biodegradable chemicals. It must be a real challenge.
And you've just highlighted there the main problem with communicating about these materials. It can be a complete minefield and nightmare. And I think we're trying to move away from using the word bioplastic because that has kind of people just confuse that and conflate is it made from biomass or is it biodegradable or is it both? So yeah, there's kind of
Mm.
four key materials that we're thinking about. So we've got bio-based, so that's a material that's either wholly or partly made of biomass, and the more biomass in that, the better, as far as we're concerned. And the
Mm.
second kind of group is your biodegradable materials, and they can be fossil-based or non-fossil based, and basically they will biodegrade in specific conditions using microbes. And then a subset of that biodegradable materials, we've got compostables. So they are biodegradable materials, but they will only biodegrade in industrial composting settings. And then the last sort of group we're looking at is bioattributed materials. So that's through the mass balance approach, where you start at the kind of the upstream end of your process and you feed in some biomass, and that will make chemical X. And then that chemical may go into a variety of different products, but you will attribute the proportion of biomass that you put in upstream to just like one of the products downstream. So it's quite complicated, the whole bio-based, biodegradable, compostable sector. But the main point that we're really trying to push is that by using biomass, it's renewable and it's more sustainable than digging up fossils.
Yeah, no, that is really helpful for you to lay that out, and thank you for correcting me on the use of bioplastic because I've heard it. I've heard the grumblings in the past about that term and the ambiguity associated with it. So that's great. I imagine that this is such a lively space as well because we've got so much happening around the globe in relation to the Global Plastics Treaty is a really hot topic right now. We've also got anti-greenwashing legislation popping up everywhere, which I'm interested in because I think that biodegradability criteria have taken sort of a hammering off the back of that, which I think has largely been driven by packaging. But I worry about a potential contagion effect to the chemicals that are actually within formulated products and losing the ability to make claims around the biodegradability. So, without getting into too much detail on the details of your strategy, are you involved in kind of standard setting or what are you using as a kind of bulwark to provide some stability to your communication?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the key things you mentioned there is standards and certifications. And it's really important that if you want to have a material that's taken seriously, that you can actually have the data to back up that it does what it says. And that's where certified materials are so important. And we either want our members to be thinking about going for certification of the materials or already have it. So there are certification standards for biodegradable materials, compostable materials, bio-based content that show you've had those materials tested and they are going to do what they're supposed to do when they come to their end of their life, whether that's an agricultural mulch film that's going to degrade in the open environment, or whether that's a piece of compostable packaging that's going to biodegrade in an industrial composting facility. I personally sit on the British Standards Institute Bio-Based Committee, which is really interesting. And also I'm involved in a project at the moment called the Bio-Based and Biodegradable Regulatory Network, where we're looking at various different things to do with standards and policy and how that can be kind of influenced positively, create a positive environment for these materials to get them to market. The other thing I just really want to jump in on is the whole plastic
Yeah,
bashing
go
thing,
ahead.
right?
Yeah.
Plastic actually is bloody awesome, right? And we need to get off this bandwagon that plastic is evil, because it's not. It's actually the way that humans have used it that's really bad. We've misused this technology, right? Plastics have allowed us to get to the moon. They allow us to have all kind of life-saving medical devices. Like plastic is actually awesome. It's just that we shouldn't be using it for stuff that it's not needed for, and single-use stuff shouldn't be allowed. And actually, it's more about the end of the life of that material, and we've allowed ourselves to produce way more than we can actually deal with. So, not anti-plastic in any shape or form, but the way we manufacture it, the feedstocks we're using, we should be using carbon that's above ground, right? So biomass, recycled carbon, or CO2 as a feedstock to really stop using the fossil resource. But this fantastic material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're touching on a topic that has really kind of caught fire in the space that I'm working in, and it's helpful to hear the different perspectives, because often you can get caught up in one line of thinking just based on the things that you're hearing, but there's definitely a real debate raging right now about plastic, and you're totally right that waste management has been an issue, wasteful single use practices, because it's been such a cheap material and the costs to society haven't been borne at the point of production. There is this real issue with too much plastic around the place, and getting out into the environment because of waste management practices. I guess another issue that's coming up as well now, because this is, like I said, this is such a hot topic. When people get really interested in it, all kinds of things start growing out of it. So for a long time, people have been talking about the health and environmental concerns of plastic particles, microplastics. More recently now, people are talking about the additives that are used in plastics as well, their potential to cause harm from leaching out into the environment, and also understanding what additives are actually used in certain applications. So it feels like others are involved in this challenge more so perhaps than the BBIA, but it is a really difficult brief to keep on top of and to manage.
It is. And we also need to remember it's not just plastics that are causing pollution. Like, I know that plastics are topical because we've had the blue planet, and everyone rightly should be concerned about pollution and toxicity, but it's about all of the waste that we're putting out there. It's not just about plastic. So we need to remember that. And sometimes if you feel pressure to switch from one type of material to another because of what's going on in the public domain, it can actually be worse for the environment. And that's why things like life cycle assessment are really, really important, because otherwise you can end up with unintended consequences. We're doing some work at the moment with the University of Sheffield through the fantastic Professor Rachel Rothman, looking around standardising life cycle assessments for bio-based and biodegradable materials, because at the moment they favour fossil incumbents, and we really want to make sure that there's a level playing field for kind of the bio-based sector. So it's so complicated, and it's really, really fascinating. But I think we just need to remember that ultimately we just need to reduce the amount of waste that we produce. I mean, I heard some horrific statistics the other day about Christmas and the amount of waste that's created. And in particular for things like wrapping paper, which can't be recycled because they often have glitter and stuff on them. The amount of trees that's in the UK are chopped down every year for wrapping paper globally, and that stuff can't be recycled. So it's just being incinerated. Like, these are all kind of choices that we're making, but in our minds it somehow seems acceptable because it's Christmas. Whereas any other day you wouldn't say, yeah, chop down every tree in the UK, that's fine. So
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think we slowly learn, and each time we hear one of these startling statistics, I think an immediate reaction is, "Oh no, that can't be true," or "Oh, that there's some sort of level of resistance." But gradually, more and more, we kind of become accustomed to addressing some of these practices, and we are making progress. Although, don't ask me to try and explain it to my mother-in-law when she comes from a trip to Hobbycraft with loads of craft materials for the kids to play with,
Yeah,
because then I feel like a real party pooper.
everything
Yeah,
in moderation.
we haven't come for balloons yet, but they're on the chopping block. So another thing that really struck me when I was at the event was the diversity of your membership, because again, you have this kind of, because it is such a broad church, seemingly, the bio-based sector, it's a real mix of startups coming up with innovative solutions to develop new materials to replace other materials, and then you've got at the other end big industrial companies that are utilizing biomass to produce chemicals that are already used but are from fossil based sources. So again, I imagine that the kind of the needs and the perspectives of those different membership stakeholders can vary a lot.
Absolutely. And I think that's both a challenge, but it's also super awesome, right? Because it's so interesting. So I guess what we're thinking about is we've got two kind of streams of thoughts. We've got how do we replace the chemicals and materials that we're using today so they're more environmentally friendly? So that's thinking about how do we replace fossil resources being used in chemicals, materials, etc. And then we've got the kind of well, what are the materials of the future that we don't even know about that we can make that are novel from better sources rather than fossils? So we've got some really cool companies who are producing some just weird and wacky things which you haven't maybe not even thought about using today. People who are using mycelium in the foundations of houses, right? Because it can be really, really strong and it can be genetically engineered to do that job. You've got people who are making trainers out of mushrooms. Like, this is so cool. And then there's even a company who are making flip flops out of seaweed, which is just awesome. And then, yeah, we've got the bigger traditional chemical companies who are really conscious that, yeah, there are other ways to make these kind of bulk commodity chemicals. And we need to start thinking about that. And then we've got quite a lot of companies who are using AI as well, which I think is awesome to try and speed up the development of kind of novel chemicals. A lot of companies we've spoken to, they've been trying to do this for 10, 20 years, trying to get a bio-based material to market. And we don't have another 10, 20 years, right, before we're all fried because it's going to be so hot. So how can we speed that up? Actually, it's awesome to see these kind of young, enthusiastic people coming through who are using AI to kind of shape what those materials might look like and how they might interact with the environment.
I see so much energy and innovation there. It's actually really refreshing when you think about some of the more kind of legacy chemical industry sort of activities that take up a lot of the time that I'm spending in day-to-day activities around the REACH regulation, for example. So that's absolutely brilliant. Another thing I noticed was value of collaboration. So you had a category around collaborations, which was, rather than having a startup kind of all out there on their own, they actually developed something that was in partnership with the more established companies, and actually they shared their expertise to bring a solution that was far better than they could have achieved separately.
Yeah, so there's the saying, isn't it? It takes a village to raise a child. Well, I think it takes a collaboration to raise a biotech SME, particularly in the kind of the bio-based bioeconomy sector. And just kind of going back to that point you mentioned around the old ICI kind of days, there used to be these huge integrated chemical sites in the UK, right? Whether it was Grangemouth or Wilton, and they all have slowly disappeared and been broken up over the years. And that's meant that we've got really disjointed supply chains in the UK that don't exist anymore. And a lot of our chemicals and
Mm.
materials manufacturing has gone abroad. So for an SME who's got a really cool idea for an awesome product, it's hard for them to think about what their route to market might be because those supply chains aren't obvious anymore in the UK. So actually, you really do need to collaborate with different people on that supply chain journey to make sure that you're a success. And I think that's why
Hmm.
collaboration is just so important. I also
Hmm.
think that actually for kind of the bio-based chemicals materials sector, getting investment is quite hard because the end product is not worth $1 million like a medicine from biopharmaceuticals, right? Where it's, I'm not saying it's easy to get investment, but it's a lot easier because your return on investment is, a lot shorter time frame and you're going to make a lot more money. So it's really important that young SMEs in the bio-based sector can work with larger organizations who can help them develop their technology, because getting that investment is just that bit harder.
Mm. Yeah, the scaling up was definitely a strong theme in all the discussions, and that really pains me to think about, because you were right. There were these startups, and there were these brilliant, intelligent, innovative, driven people. Each one had their own massive mission and an amazing product, and then the market conditions were just hitting them like a wall when it got to a certain point and preventing them from moving forward. I mean, what do you think of the other than, well, you talked about the value of the end product. I mean, what can be done to get more investment in this area, or raise the value of the the
Yeah.
end solution?
The two key things for me, the first is market demand, and the second is investor confidence, right? So for market
Mm,
demand, because bio-based products are inherently a bit more expensive than your fossil-based, because as we've spoken about, they're just so cheap. We really need market demand, and the government has a really key role to play here, right? If the government mandated that products had to have a certain percentage of bio-based chemicals or plastics or materials in them, that would suddenly create a huge market. Say, for example, if
mm,
the NHS, if a lot of their kind of chemicals and plastics had to have a bio-based content, that would be huge. So we really need to create a market demand that is consistent so that there's that offtake for products. And then in terms of investor certainty, that would help with that, right? Because there'd be offtake agreements for these
mm,
companies. But also for investor confidence, we need long-term strategy, right? The UK government is not very good at long-term strategy. It goes in government cycles. And actually, what we need is a 10-year plus industrial strategy, which fingers crossed we might be getting in
mm,
2025, which actually says there is a role for bio-based materials and the bioeconomy, and we're going to put some money behind it, and it's here for the long term. And then we would get both investor confidence and market demand, and then hopefully the sector could take off. The other one thing that we need, after I go on my little rant, is that we need feedstock certainty, right? So these materials are going to rely on biomass, and wouldn't it be great if that could be UK biomass, whether that's
mm.
waste materials, agricultural waste, etc. Because then you're not creating a huge logistical challenge that's pumping out more carbon dioxide by having to transport it around. That we want some UK biomass ring fenced so that people can utilize that to make these products and materials that we need. Because at the moment, the UK government is primarily, wanting biomass to be burnt for bioenergy. And actually, there's
Mm.
so much more we can do with that biomass before we burn it. Burning should be the last option. Let's extract all the
Yeah,
really useful, high value chemicals and everything else out of that biomass first before we go and burn it. So we want some biomass
yeah,
ring fence.
yeah. It's a really good point. I mean, when you think about the advancements in technology and what can actually be done with these materials, it does seem a real waste to still be only trying to recover energy from the waste. Um, and before we go on to the kind of government policy area, I think you've also touched on what we're looking at here is a real kind of paradigm shift, aren't we, in how industry is actually organized with the bio-based sector. The industrial economy has grown out of fossil fuels, and as a result, we've had these very centralized industrial structures where materials have been channeled into and things have been made that are of value, and then those have been distributed all around the world in our globalized world. Whereas we're almost talking here about moving back to localized situations where local resources can be used to produce things on perhaps a smaller scale, distributed at a smaller scale, and even organized through local communities, in a kind of extreme sort of situation. So I imagine that a lot of our economic systems would push back or would naturally kind of resist that kind of a transition.
Yeah, and it's always hard, right, when a disruptive technology comes in, because you've got the players in the old technology who don't want to have to rise to the challenge or change because they've got some shareholders who want their shareholders' dividends, right, every year, and it's going to cost a lot of money to move away from that. But I think we just need to start thinking about what's the world going to look like in 10, 20 years' time. And actually, we should be thinking about that's the vision, how do we get there, rather than what's today looking like and isn't it awful? Because we do have the means to do this. And as you said, the bioeconomy really does have the potential to have both. You can have a huge biorefinery, right? And we've got examples of that in Teesside. We've got Ensus who are making bioethanol from wheat. Or we can have distributed manufacturing where you can have lots of different sites across the UK using local feedstocks, local supply chains, and producing things locally. And if we look back at COVID, which I mean, that's like a zombie horror film, isn't it? Which kind of didn't really even happen in my mind. But if we look back at COVID, people were scrabbling around trying to get chemicals and materials that they needed for the NHS, whether it was PPE, whether it was critical raw materials for pharmaceuticals. And that's because we don't manufacture them in the UK anymore. And actually, we need to make sure that we are resilient in the future. And I'm not saying we should forget about global trade, because obviously that's really important. But when we think about those things that we do want to be able to access and the things that are important to us, let's try and rebuild those supply chains in the UK, but let's do it in like a sustainable fashion. And actually, the UK, because we are a small island, does have the ability to do this. We just need to kind of all come together and get our thinking caps on and start doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it does. When you talk about it, it does sound really exciting. You know, the potential vision that could be realized if people were ambitious and willing to embrace a new vision
And take
seems
some
really
risks, right?
transformative.
And take
Yes,
some risks,
yeah,
because not everything's going to work out, right? But the UK is not very good at taking risks. If you look at
mm,
America and the USA, and I know loads of people always talk about this, that if you haven't failed a few times in the US, then you're not worth talking to, right? Failing at stuff is
yeah.
almost like your rite passage kind of thing. So we just need to accept that not everything's going to work. But if we actually just go for it, we've actually got some awesome academics in the UK, right? We churn out IP and ideas like no one's business, probably top in the world. But what we're not good at is translating those ideas into real life things. And what we need to do is kind of reshore that manufacturing back into the UK and start making those kind of materials of the future, like on our doorstep, because it would provide high paid jobs, food security, energy security, all these things. And we could be a real leader in this area. Have I sold it to you yet?
Yeah, I think so. I think I was going to say you're speaking a bit to, I think, British risk aversion there in terms of there's still a fear of getting something wrong. You'd rather not take the risk than actually,
Yeah.
yeah, take the risk and have the chance of things improving. But a life without taking risks is, a life potentially not worth living. So yeah, I think we do need to embrace that growth mindset a bit more as a society in the UK.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess another thing to mention, which I think you've touched on, is this has the potential to revitalize not just the typical economic centres in the UK, but some of these old industrial and rural economies as well, where there's so much sort of deprivation now.
Absolutely. So yeah, places like Teesside, like Grangemouth, like down in Wales, these kind of old sites which are slowly being shut down over the years. There's still fantastic assets at some of these sites that can be used right. And actually,
Yeah,
what's really cool is that those sites have this like really strong heritage and an amazing skill base of people whose parents or grandparents or great great grandparents have worked in these places. So my granddad used to work at ICI, right, in Teesside. And that's only like, 2 generations away. So there's all these people who've got connections and family members and stories to tell about these, massive industrial sites. And they kind of now have these negative connotations where you think of big plumes of smoke but actually what we need to do is rebuild them, but without that smoke, right, into more sustainable sites. And the infrastructure's still there. We just need to do it. So there's a huge opportunity to kind of reinvigorate those kind of dirty industrial sites into really kind of clean tech centers of excellence. And then when you talked about the like rural economy, definitely. Like, so I'm in Inverness in Scotland, and there's many fantastic things that Scotland has, but one of them is natural resources, right? Seaweed coming out of every coastal line. And these are the things that we should be thinking about. How can we utilize our natural resources for the kind of products of the future? There's loads of really cool companies who are trying to manufacture, well, utilize seaweed to make biodegradable, compostable packaging, to extract really valuable nutraceuticals for kind of like medicines. Like, and this is the stuff that's on our doorstep. So we need to be thinking more about what is nature actually giving us that's natural that we can utilize. And that's really going to help rural communities, because this kind of biomass is growing where in really rural areas, which will help those communities, flourish.
Yeah, no, it's really great for you to provide that, that those examples that really kind of paint this picture of the potential here and what value might be right under people's noses that we haven't seen. And I can certainly recognize, the need for some rejuvenation in these places. Being a northern lad from Wigan myself. So let's just get on to the UK sort of government side of things. So one thing I noticed from the Demeter Awards was that there was political buy-in to the activity as well. You had government ministers there. You had Lord Deben giving out the award. We even had Lord Valence, who's come in to champion what's happening here, and it's all linked to the UK strategy on engineering biology. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so it was fantastic, the support that we've had from government, and particularly the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, who quite rightly spend lots of our wonderful taxpayers' money on research and development into these kind of novel bio-based, biodegradable and compostable materials. Through the engineering biology vision, I think, was that published last year? I can't remember, the years are going so quickly. Might have been earlier this year. Yeah, that's really exciting. And then seeing that with the new Labour government that they're still backing that is fantastic. And really, I mean, engineering biology, synthetic biology, whatever you want to call it, industrial biotechnology, it's not something new, right? It's been around for decades. But people have really been thinking about how can we use that for medicines and kind of life-saving treatments. And actually, there's so much cool stuff we can do with microbes by engineering them, or by engineering different parts of processes using kind of biology to make products and chemicals. And it's only now that that's kind of come to the forefront of people's thinking. But I mean, again, that's also been going on for decades. But just as I said earlier, it's taking a long time to scale up those processes. Biology is awesome, right? And I would say that because I've got a biology undergraduate and I did a biochemistry PhD. But like, it's so awesome. Like, we've been provided with this earth that really does have all the things that we need already. So we need to be kind of harnessing that and thinking about how can we use it more. We've seen in papers recently that there's bacteria that have learned how to eat plastic in landfill sites. They've evolved, right? And that just shows the capabilities of kind of like that nature has. So yeah, the engineering biology vision is fantastic. Fingers crossed when we have the critical spending review come out in the new year that there will be lots of money ring fenced for this area, so that we can kind of continue to kind of do that research and development. What I will say though is we need to make sure that there's no barriers to getting these products onto the market, which there sadly are today. I already talked about the biomass being preferred for kind of the use of bioenergy and synthetic aviation fuels rather than for chemicals and materials. But there's also other policy barriers around sort of end of life of these materials, and sort of the policy around there around simpler recycling and extended producer responsibility. We want compostable and biodegradable, as long as they're certified, materials and chemicals to be promoted. And actually, we need policies in place so that that happens, particularly to do with end of life of compostable materials. We want industrial composting facilities. We need more of them. We need more funding for that. So we need to make sure that we're not only investing in R&D, but that these materials can get to market, and that at the end of their life, they can go to the place they're intended to go to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there does seem like a huge amount of policy work that's needed. And you already talked about some of the barriers in terms of fossil fuel subsidies and the need to potentially provide a lever to get organizations to make more use of these materials while we transition towards that sort of an economy. You also, the BBIA published a report earlier this year, or it was Innovate UK, or which was around some of the barriers, right?
Yeah, so that was a 6-month project we had funded by Innovate UK, looking at some of the barriers to the commercialisation of bio-based, biodegradable and compostable chemicals and materials. I think that the starting point from that for me was that there's 56 different government departments involved in the commercialisation of these materials, right? I mean, apparently there's 606 government departments in total, which I didn't realise there was that many departments and agencies, but 56 of them are involved. And for an SME or someone starting out, that must just be a complete whoa. Like, where do you even
Yeah.
begin? That whole regulation piece, there's so many different departments involved in it, depending on what your end market is. And if you're making something that could go into 20 different end markets, that's, 20 times the heartache. So we really do need to streamline that regulatory process. I
Yeah,
don't want
I'll
to,
come in on that regulation side.
yeah,
Yeah, because I mean, even as somebody who works with regulation every day, even I was surprised at quite how
yeah,
many different regulations that need to be dealt with by, like you say, these SME organizations. And I was only thinking about one in particular. I was thinking about the REACH regulation, which
yeah.
obviously we have a UK version and we also have an EU version. But I imagine that a lot of these bio-based materials could be new materials, and they could also be materials that have complex composition, so they have more than one chemical constituent in their makeup. Those create, really big challenges to actually assessing them from a regulatory compliance point of view, testing and evaluating their properties, and ultimately getting them registered. And also, if they are new materials, then you'll have all these costs associated with generating the data to actually support those new products, which could be a real barrier to getting these things onto the market. And I wonder if the UK was even thinking about providing some kind of breathing room to allow some of these new materials to be evaluated in a more streamlined way so that they have a chance to gain sort of market acceptance. It feels to me like there's a way of balancing those risks.
Absolutely. And then I think if you're throwing on top of that, that some of these products might have been done by engineering biology, right? That's another whole host of regulations on top of that. So I was at a really
Mm.
good round table last week with one of our BBIA members called Twig, who are looking at manufacturing a cosmetic ingredient. And they're trying to navigate the regulatory environment, right, for manufacturing of cosmetics that are potentially from biologically engineered sources. And that is a whole minefield, right? Because there just isn't really a clear pathway at the moment. But it was really, really interesting. There was people there from DBT, from DSIT, and actually, these people really do want to streamline it. And there was in September, it was the Regulatory Innovation Office was announced, which is part of DSIT, and they're looking for sort of
Mm.
low hanging fruit and projects they can work on. And I think they're really keen to pick up the whole kind of engineering biology piece in terms of how can we actually think about these novel chemicals and materials that are going to be coming out and not make it so time consuming and so intensive for SMEs to get through that process. Yes, we obviously safety is the key thing, right? And we're not going to cut corners on anything to do with safety. But how can we make sure that these materials and products are getting to market? Because the runway an SME has in terms of its cash does not fit with the timeline of the regulatory process at the moment. So there's lots of
Mm.
SMEs that are just disappearing and dying simply because
Mm.
they can't navigate the regulatory environment, and that we can't let that happen.
Yeah, no, it does seem like a real shame a waste of human effort. You mentioned a few acronyms there. So did you say DSIP?
DSIT, so sorry, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, and DBT is
Yeah,
the Department of Business and Trade.
great. No,
Yeah.
that's good. Just for my benefit and anyone else who's listening, that's great. Do you think that as well? I mean, I know we live in a kind of a globalized economy, and probably the main trading partner with the UK would still be the EU, but potentially there is also an opportunity here for the UK in this area to be targeted to try to encourage this nascent sector, which may give the UK an opportunity. where the EU might be a bit slower.
In terms of sort of us diverging away from EU regulations, are you talking about here?
Well, I mean, just in ways to encourage the bio-based sector within the UK.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I guess we are no longer part of the EU, which for me is a huge sadness. But there could be an opportunity through that for us to streamline our regulatory process. I was at a Royal Society of Chemistry event a couple of months ago around kind of a UK chemical strategy. And does the UK need its own kind of chemicals agency where we can
Mm,
really streamline regulations? And I think the outcome of that was a bit mixed. Should we be diverging away from the EU or shouldn't we? And on one point, yes, we want to streamline it, but on another point, if they're a major market for us, we have to adhere to their regulations anyway, and let's not reinvent the wheel.
yeah,
So I've had examples of BBIA members who have told me for the new kind of REACH, the UK REACH, they've had to go to the EU and ask for access to some data, and they've had to pay
yeah,
a huge amount, right? We're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds for data that would have usually been free had we not left the EU.
yeah,
So we can't have our regulations identical to every single market, right? Because you've got the States, you've got China, etc. But I think it's a fine line between streamlining and trying to improve our own regulations without diverging away from other markets too much. But
yes, yeah. No,
I do think the UK can be a leader.
exactly. That's sort of what I'm thinking as well. I don't think anybody wants to see standards of health or environmental protection being watered down, through divergence from what's happening at the EU. At the same time, I'm seeing the divergence is happening every day that ticks by because the EU has a huge program of new regulations that it is introducing as part of the Green Deal, which continues to rumble forward. And on the UK side, I'm seeing I don't really know what the strategy is at this point. Whether it's just sort of wait and see, watch what they do, and see how it pans out before doing anything. But what I can say is that it's seemingly not working what we have in place right now because there's a huge amount of bureaucracy that's been generated through reproducing processes that were run by the European Union, the Commission, ECHA, and 28 member states that's now being duplicated in the UK. It seems a huge waste of effort. So I definitely think things need to be looked at. I don't know whether a standalone agency would be the solution, but something different to what we have now for sure.
Yeah, totally agree.
Great. Great. And then you also, I think you mentioned the BB RegNet. Perhaps you could explain again what that stands for and then talk a little bit more about what's happening there.
Yeah. So BB RegNet. So this is a project which has been funded by the UK government. It's to set up a network of stakeholders who are working in the bio-based, biodegradable, compostable materials and chemical sector to generate evidence to help policymakers make informed decisions, which is based on data rather than kind of hearsay. So BB RegNet stands for the Bio-Based and Biodegradable Materials Regulatory Network. We've got 12 months, so we've got £500,000 of funding, which is pretty cool. And we're going to be looking at various different aspects of the commercialization of these materials where there's kind of gaps in data that need filling in. So as I said earlier, one of them is around life cycle assessment and kind of standards and certification. We've also got one, a kind of research group that's looking at end of life and dealing with the end of life of these materials, and also in terms of biomass utilization that I touched on earlier. So thinking about a biomass utilization framework where, burning biomass should be the end option rather than the first option. We've also got some people who are looking at the kind of the way we can communicate about these materials, particularly to consumers who don't really understand the technicalities of it and really just want to know, what should I do with this at its end of its useful life, and know that I'm doing the right thing. And really, we're going to generate all this evidence and then work with policymakers, and hopefully they can use it to create a more favourable kind of policy environment for these materials. One of the working packages, which I'm really excited about, is focusing on the economics of it. because that really can pull some levers in government. So sort of like what could the benefits be to this sector in terms of business growth if there were policy incentives in place? And then things like, what if the carbon border adjustment mechanism includes chemicals in the future? What does that mean? We should really be onshoring kind of manufacturing. Lots of different kind of aspects to the research, and anyone is welcome to join in on that research. And we want as many stakeholders as possible to join in so that we get the biggest evidence base. So if anyone wants to hear more about that, go to the BBIA website, bbia.org.uk. Nice little plug there. I haven't got a book coming out soon. That's what usually happens on these podcasts, isn't it? Someone has a book that's coming out that we can plug. There's no book coming out, but we will have a new website in the new year.
Very good. I will definitely put that information in the show notes. So yeah, anybody who's listening and who cares about this topic, I really encourage you to reach out to the BBIA and have a look at joining this BBRegNet network, because I think we've established today that this is a really important and transformative area that's going to have a real impact in the years to come on society. Jen, just before we wrap up, when I was inviting you to this podcast, I noticed that you have a consultancy, or you had a consultancy, Frey Consulting, and I'm also, yeah,
I do.
tell us about that.
I do. My side hustle, as I like to call it. No, so I have always been really passionate about biochemistry, biology, biotech, etc. And I have my own consultancy called Frey Consulting. That's named after my daughter, who's called Freya. And I set that up about 2 years ago. So I work with various different companies who are in the kind of sustainable biomanufacturing sector, helping them with strategy, business development, marketing, and comms. So I've been fortunate to work with lots of different companies over the past kind of couple of years doing that. And actually, two of the big government projects that I've been involved in was through my consultancy. So one was for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, looking at the role of biomass and biochemicals. And the other one was for Innovate UK, looking at sustainable carbon for the chemicals industry. So it's awesome to have my own little consultancy where I can get involved in those really awesome kind of projects that are out there. And Chris, I know you've set up your consultancy recently, and I think having that ability to get involved in loads of different things that you find interesting, for me, is fascinating and really rewarding.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear a bit more about that. When I noticed that, I thought, oh, another entrepreneur. So really good. And yeah, if anyone's interested in reaching out to Jen for any of that support, then please feel free. So just a couple of things now before we wrap up, Jen. I'm making a point of asking people a couple of rapid fire questions, sort of quick answers. So first of all, a big goal that you're working towards in the months ahead, and it can be a personal or professional one.
Oh, a big goal I'm working to in the upcoming months ahead. Can I have a personal and a professional one? Can I be greedy? Yeah. Let's go professional, right? 2025, I would love to double the membership of the BBIA, because that would be a real sign to people that this is going to happen. So I'll be working towards that. And then personally, I'm trying to get back out on the bike a bit more. And I've entered the Loch Ness Tap, which is a bike race which goes the whole way around Loch Ness, for the third time that I've done it. And I'm determined to do it in under 3 hours, 20 minutes, because I've done it in like 3:22 and 3:28, I think it was. So I've been spending a lot of time on the turbo in the garage, which is soul destroying. But yeah, so that's my ambition. That's April that takes place.
Awesome. Well, hopefully it will all pay off in the end, all that time on the turbo. No, thank you for that. And then the last one is one piece of advice that you'd give to yourself starting out in your career.
Oh, wow. That's a really difficult one. One piece of advice I'd give to myself: choose your boss. Choose your boss, not necessarily the company. Choose your boss. 9 out of 10 people leave their boss, not the company, right? And I've had the privilege and also the unfortunateness of having some really awesome bosses and some really awful bosses. Like awesome and awful. One of the best bosses I ever had was a gentleman called Steve Bagshaw. I'll make sure he gets a copy of this podcast so he knows I'm bigging him up. Fantastic guy when I was at Fujifilm Diosynth. And he really taught me, actually, you need to have a boss who you like, respect, and who can bring something to you personally and professionally. make sure your boss is invested in you and you're invested in them. And also, the other piece of advice, don't be afraid to do stuff that you're not qualified to do, because you only learn from doing that, right? If someone throws something at you and says, fancy doing this, and you think, oh, I'm not sure if I can do it, just do it anyway. Just do it anyway. That's how we learn and grow.
Beautiful. I could not agree more. Jen, it's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for all the information you provided there, and conveying the passion and the mission and the opportunity of the bio-based sector and the work the BBIA is doing. What we'll do is we'll put some of that information in the show notes as well, so people can access, follow up on some of the things we've talked about. Thanks very much, everybody who's been listening. Your time is really precious, so I'm so grateful you've spent it with us today. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please like it, comment on it, subscribe, and spread the word about the Chemical Journeys podcast. We've got more conversations like this to come, so look out for further updates, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, Jen.
Thank you.